Thank you, Dr. Claussen. I'm so grateful to you for having me back here at Wake Forest, and I'm really grateful to all of you for being here. So as Dr. Claussen said, I'll be engaging this evening with Jewish traditions of Musar. Musar is a Hebrew word that, broadly speaking, refers to Jewish discourse about character and virtue. Traditions of reflecting on what kinds of people we should be, not just what we should do or what rules we should follow, but what we should be like, how we should be people of good character, how we should be shaped by virtues, how we should cultivate virtues. By virtues, I mean good character traits, moral qualities that can be cultivated, such as compassion or kindness, love, justice, humility, honesty, courage, forgiveness, solidarity, responsibility. Musar includes reflection on what it means to work towards or to possess all of these kinds of virtues, what it means to be compassionate, what it means to be kind, what it means to be honest, and so on, and how we might become more compassionate and more kind and more honest, and so on. Jewish teachings in this genre, Jewish teachings about moral character and virtue, are wildly diverse. Jews have made a lot of claims shaped by Jewish traditions and identities and histories about what it means to be a good person, what it means to live with virtue, and those claims are often very much at odds with each other. And that's certainly true when it comes to questions of how to respond to calls to support war and mass violence. Historically, Jews have taken a really wide range of positions about war and violence, reflecting pretty much the same kind of range of positions that you can find within any human group. And they've appealed to a wide range of virtues in doing so. Some Jews have argued against war and violence by invoking justice and compassion and solidarity and courage and humility and many other virtues. And Jews have argued also in favor of war and violence by invoking those very same sorts of virtues. Jewish writing on all of these themes is part of the history of Musar literature. A lot of my teaching and writing, the writing that Dr. Claussen referred to, focuses on the historic diversity of Musar literature and historic debates within that literature about war and violence. And I think there's a lot to be gained from studying debates. But this evening I want to try something a little bit different. Instead of focusing on the diversity of Jewish approaches, I want to focus on just a few ideas from the history of Musar literature that I think may be helpful for responding to the mass killing that's ongoing in Gaza at this particular moment. I'll share just a few of those ideas and a few of my reflections on those ideas, and then I'll look forward to hearing your thoughts and your reflections as well. I should say this is not an easy topic to discuss. I should acknowledge, first of all, I think that the topic of mass killing in Gaza is an increasingly dangerous topic to speak about, especially on college campuses, given the way that speech about Gaza on campuses is being monitored by the federal government and serving as a pretext for arresting and detaining and deporting many of our friends and colleagues. And more broadly, as I trust you know, this is obviously a highly divisive topic, a highly fraught topic. I'll assume that there's a range of views about the violence in Israel-Palestine within this room, and that odds are decent that many people within this space have deep personal connections to that violence. We have friends or we have family members who over the last 18 months have been killed or injured or held hostage or displaced or faced with disease or starvation, or whose fate is unknown right now. Many of us feel traumatized by the violence of the last 18 months. Many of us have been filled with despair, seeing a situation that seems to grow worse and worse and more hopeless. I don't think there's any clear way through the despair or the trauma or the fear or the terror or the anger or the rage that many of us may feel, or the tears or the sadness. But I would like to think that traditions of Musar can help, even just a little bit. I think there's important work to do in nurturing the character traits that we need when we face a crisis, like the crisis that's ongoing at this moment in Israel-Palestine. In responding to the present crisis, I think that we need a lot of the character traits that have been the focus of so much of Musar literature. We need virtues of love and compassion and kindness and justice and responsibility and a sense of solidarity and courage and humility and equanimity and honesty and so many other character traits as well. We need every one of them. And in particular, we need these virtues as we think about, as each one of you thinks about how to respond to ongoing calls to justify and support the mass killing of civilians. I'm going to focus this evening on that problem, that we continue to hear calls to support mass violence against civilians in Israel-Palestine. Sometimes those calls come from those supporting violence against Israeli civilians, from those who justified the atrocities against Israeli civilians 18 months ago, and who advocate for continued violent resistance against Israel by any means necessary, no matter how much mass killing may be required. More commonly in the United States today, those calls come from those who justify mass violence against Palestinian civilians, who argue for continued efforts to fight Hamas by any means necessary, often no matter how much mass killing may be required. I'll focus especially this evening on those calls, not only because they're the subject of a good deal of my research, but also because of how prominent they are in the United States today, and because of the magnitude of the violence against Palestinians, bless you, the Palestinians in Gaza at this moment. I don't want to minimize the violence against Israelis or the threat of future violence against Israelis, but I think at this moment it's important to give particular attention to the ways that we respond to what I see as pretty ubiquitous calls to justify and support continued violence in Gaza. Violence which continues to kill Palestinian non-combatants and which also threatens the Israeli hostages held in captivity in Gaza. Those calls continue to come from people in positions of significant power, government officials and communal leaders and religious leaders and others, some identifying as secular, some identifying as religious, Christians and Jews, and people of a variety of other identities, who often insist that the killing of civilians is tragic, but that, alas, it must continue. Alas, it is brutal, some argue, but you should support Israel's military campaign no matter how many tens of thousands are killed, no matter even how many tens of thousands of children are killed, because there can be no other way for Israel to be safe. My contention is that we should respond to these calls as we respond to all calls to support violence against civilians with virtues. We should be guided by love and compassion and justice and responsibility and a sense of solidarity and courage and humility and equanimity and honesty and so many other character traits. And above all, I want to single out 3 of those character traits that are essential for responding to calls to support violence against civilians: justice and compassion and solidarity. When we're confronted with calls to support such violence, we should seek, I think, to be people characterized by justice and characterized by compassion and characterized by solidarity. We should seek to demonstrate justice as a virtue and compassion as a virtue and solidarity as a virtue. We should be just, we should be compassionate, and we should show solidarity. One reason that I single out these 3 virtues is that they're virtues that have often been marshaled by those who have supported the ongoing violence. Those who sought to justify the horrific violence against civilians in Israel on October 7th, 2023, have argued that justice for Palestinians and compassion for Palestinians and solidarity with Palestinians should lead us to support such attacks. And those who have sought to justify the horrific violence against Palestinian civilians in the year and a half since then have argued that justice for Israelis and compassion for Israelis and solidarity with Israelis should lead us to support that violence. Yes, they argue the mass killing of civilians and the destruction of civilian infrastructure, and the humanitarian disaster in Gaza is tragic, but justice and compassion and solidarity with the people on our side demand that we stand with Israel. When we're confronted with calls like this, I want us to collectively respond with more capacious models of justice and compassion and solidarity. Wisdom for how to do that can be found in literatures from all sorts of traditions and all sorts of cultures, and one of those many resources is Musar literature, Jewish literature about virtue and character, which I think can offer us a great deal. So I'll turn to that wisdom now. Traditions of Jewish wisdom about what it means to be a person of justice, what it means to be a person of compassion, and what it means to be a person characterized by solidarity when we're faced with calls for violence. I want to begin by focusing on justice as a virtue. Justice is a word that can be used in many different ways, but I invite you to think about it as a virtue, as a positive character trait, as a quality that characterizes human beings at their best and towards which we should aspire. We're obligated to act with justice, including as we respond to calls to support violence against civilians. There are an endless number of ways that traditions about justice may shape our responses, but I'll share just 3 pieces of Musar wisdom that I think are important amidst our current crisis. 3 ways of thinking about justice that complement each other, each of which I think is valuable in responding to mass killing, and which I have printed on the handout that I think you all have in front of you. Number 1 on that handout is that a person of justice will be disposed not only to seek just ends, but also to insist on just means. Justice is a disposition not only to work for ends that are just, but also to ensure that the means of achieving those ends are just, to recognize that the ends do not justify the means. In the language of the book of Deuteronomy, as I've quoted it here on your handout, justice shall you pursue, repeating the word justice. Why is justice written twice? According to one tradition of Musar, we must pursue just ends, but we must also employ just means. In the phrase attributed to the 19th century Rabbi Simcha Bunim of Pezhisha, the commandment is to pursue justice justly. Justice is mentioned once to remind us that the ends we seek must be just, but it's mentioned again to remind us that the means we use must be just as well. In this understanding, one cannot be a person of justice if one is seeking justice by any means necessary. One can't be a person of justice and justify war just because one sees that the justice it will bring about, if it's successful, will be ideal. War must only be pursued for just causes, but only if those causes can be pursued without producing an excess of new injustices. Many people who have sought to justify the mass killing in Israel-Palestine over the past year and a half have argued that the violence on one side or another must be justified because it's well-intentioned, because it's seeking admirable goals of safety or of liberation, and that it's admirable to pursue those goals by any means necessary, or by almost any means necessary, because the ends justify the means. When we hear calls to acquiesce to that kind of violence, part of the wisdom of the Musar tradition that we might hold up is that we must pursue justice justly. Good intentions are not enough, especially when we know that violence in pursuit of admirable goals will almost certainly kill people who do not deserve to die. It's not enough to have the best intentions in pursuing justice. To be people of justice, we must ensure that justice is being pursued justly. A second aspect of justice, as you can see on your handout, is that justice is a disposition to respect the equality of all people, and so to act according to the golden rule that Musar thinkers have often imagined as standing at the heart of Torah, that one must love one's fellow as oneself, and that you cannot do to your fellow that which would be hateful to you. According to the ancient sage, the ancient Rabbi Hillel, as recorded in the Talmud, this is the principle that encapsulates the entire Torah, upon which All else is commentary. That which is hateful to you, do not do to another. In one tradition of Musar, this is the essence of justice as a virtue. The 19th century Musar teacher, Menachem Mendel Levin, for example, characterized the essence of justice in this way, using the Hebrew word for justice, tzedek, and then quoting Hillel, justice means that which is hateful to you, do not do to another. Justice from this perspective means not causing harm to others or their families that we would hate to have visited upon ourselves or our own families. Acting with justice requires a commitment that others should be treated as we would want to be treated, that other people's families should be treated as we would want our families to be treated, that other people's children are treated as we would want our children to be treated. I think that those with that kind of sense of justice find it very difficult to defend military operations that kill innocent people, as both defenders of Hamas and defenders of the Israel Defense Forces have continued to do over the past year and a half. For example, those tempted to support Israeli military operations that may target dangerous terrorists but will certainly kill innocent civilians should recognize that they would oppose attacks that targeted terrorists if it were their families that were in proximity and would be killed. They should recognize that they would be outraged if Israeli children were routinely killed in Israeli military operations against Hamas to the extent that Palestinian children are being killed by such operations. But many of them, of course, feel differently when the children being killed are Palestinian. Similarly, of course, those defending violence against Israeli non-combatants by Palestinians feel that Israeli children's lives are expendable in ways that Palestinian children's lives are not. Even if we're not actively defending the killing of innocent children or other innocent civilians, many more of us are inclined to draw lines between us and them and to treat the lives of those on one side as worth more than the lives of those on the other side. When we're faced with calls to draw such lines, I think we should keep in mind the Musar tradition that justice as a virtue requires acting from a commitment that we should not support doing to others what we would not want done to us. Some people, of course, insist that killing one's enemies who might seem to be innocent is justified because they're in fact guilty. People defending violence on both sides of the war sometimes engage in this kind of reasoning as well. Well, it's fine to kill their children because their children are in fact guilty. Right? They're part of the enemy. They're part of the machine of colonialism. They're part of the culture of terrorism. They'll grow up to kill us. And with that in mind, I want to hold up a third aspect of justice as a virtue, the third item under justice on your handout. Justice includes the disposition not to assume the guilt of others, and so not to assume that others deserve death. The principle at work is that we should be extremely cautious in assuming the guilt of others, in assuming that their deaths are justified, and we should reject claims that whole populations deserve to be destroyed. The character of Abraham, the patriarch featured in the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, and rabbinic literature, has often been understood by Musar teachers as offering a model for how to stand up against assuming guilt in this way. In the book of Genesis, Abraham stands up to God's plan to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty in the city of Sodom, as Abraham puts it, and to sweep away the innocent along with the guilty. Musar teachers have often emphasized that Abraham was exemplary in his efforts to show that even those who seemed guilty did not deserve to die. I put one of those framings on the handout here from the early 20th century Musar teacher Avraham Shmuel Finkel, who described how Abraham argued at length for them, searching for any opening he could find, persistently, even just for a small reason to save them. The wisdom here is that even when it's tempting to write people off because they are surrounded by wickedness, we should search out and recognize their goodness, and we should certainly refrain from justifying their deaths. And if we should protest the killing of those who might be innocent, as Abraham did, we should certainly object to the injustice of killing those in war who are clearly innocent. There's one midrash, one classical rabbinic interpretation on this theme that describes the first war in human history when Abraham fought to rescue his nephew Lot from captivity as a hostage. The midrash describes the justice of Abraham's fear that he might have killed even one righteous person. This offers a lesson in Musar for us, that we should recoil from the potential death of even one innocent person as Abraham did, and we should certainly regard the mass killing of innocent people as evil. We should reject the kinds of assertions of collective guilt that have been widespread among defenders of Hamas violence and among defenders of Israeli military violence. When we hear calls to view an entire people as guilty, or an entire nation as guilty, we should challenge those calls just as Abraham did. Amid the ongoing calls to support the destruction of Gaza, we should stand up like Abraham to demand that the innocent not be punished along with the guilty. And we should argue at length for them, searching for any opening we can find, persistently, looking for even a small reason to save their lives. Those are three dimensions of justice as a virtue that I think are important to cultivate during this crisis. Justice is, I think, the most important virtue to keep in mind when we're responding to calls to support mass killing. But I do want to also speak briefly about two other character traits that I think are best understood as supporting justice, which are compassion and solidarity. On your handout, virtue number 2, you'll see that I'm framing compassion as the disposition to respond to the suffering of others with empathy and altruism, and insofar as it's possible, with action to relieve that suffering. Many of us recognize that we have a responsibility to respond to suffering with compassion and to do what we can to stop people from bringing greater suffering to the world. That responsibility can be described in many ways, in many languages. One evocative Hebrew language phrase used in some Musar literature to describe compassion is the Hebrew phrase noseh be'ol im chavero, bearing the burden with the other, or sharing the burden. That's the framing of compassion that was central to the teachings of Rabbi Simcha Zissel Ziv, one of the leaders of the 19th century Eastern European Musar movement, a movement that sought to place Musar at the center of Jewish education. Simcha Zissel identified sharing the burden as the highest virtue demanded by the Torah, and a virtue that should be central to our retelling of the story of how the people of Israel were liberated from slavery in Egypt. That's an especially appropriate framing for this moment on the Jewish calendar. Right now, it's the holiday of Pesach, Passover, a holiday commemorating liberation from slavery, led in part by Moses, where compassionately sharing the burden can be viewed as key to that liberation. Simcha Zissel, this 19th century Musar teacher, saw sharing the burden as exemplified in the early life of Moses. Moses learned to share the burden of others while he was a prince in Pharaoh's palace. He could have enjoyed power and tranquility there as an Egyptian without any concern for the enslaved Israelites, but he was able, remarkably, to turn beyond the palace, to turn toward the other, and to see those who were enslaved and to bring the suffering of the enslaved into his heart, as Simcha Zissel puts it, so that his heart would feel their pain as if he himself was in this pain. Moses filled his mind with images of suffering of others, and, Simcha Zissel writes, habituated himself to seeing these images to such an extent that he felt their pain as if he himself was in such pain, and so he came to be sharing their burden. In Simcha Zissel's recounting, this virtue becomes instilled deeply within Moses, and he comes to understand the obligation to share the burden. But he also comes to understand how difficult this is and how we need images imprinted on our minds of the suffering of others. As Simcha Zissel put it, we all have an obligation to be like Moses at that moment of insight, to keep in mind the suffering of others and to do what we can to imprint their suffering on our minds. I've included a snippet from his discussion on the handout. He writes, "It is only possible to feel another person's pain and to share their burden through significant images, so that with all the pain and suffering and injury which happened to them, it is as if it happened to oneself. And what one would ask from one's fellow for oneself, that they should at least share in bearing one's burden, so one should ask oneself to act for one's fellow." Compassion here goes hand in hand with justice and should be guided by the golden rule. Just as we want others to share our burdens, we're required to share the burdens of others. Just as we want our suffering to be relieved, we should want the suffering of others to be relieved. The only way to do that effectively in this framing is to keep images of the suffering of others before one's eyes. Only then will we actually feel their suffering, which we too easily avoid. Feeling the suffering of others and seeking to respond to that suffering can only go so far, especially because most of us only have so much capacity for empathy, and our empathy is always selective. We'll often take compassion very seriously, but only for our own group, or for our own people, or for our own nation. In my view, the best models of Musar understand that our obligations to the other extend broadly and should be guided by principles of justice, seeing the moral equality of all human beings so that we don't just value the suffering of one side and respond to that suffering by inflicting even greater suffering on the other side. Over the past year and a half of violence in Israel-Palestine, there have been far too many examples of people who proclaim their compassion for their people and justify causing extreme suffering for another people. People who think that mass violence is the solution often speak of compassion, but prefer to ignore the suffering that their violence inflicts. Or they explain it as a tragic necessity. For example, saying, "We have compassion for the children of Gaza, but Hamas is an existential threat, and so what can we do but continue the operations that will kill, tragically, more and more children? It's tragic, but we must protect our people." I think that the example of Moses, who turns away from his peace in the Egyptian palace to identify with slaves who he previously did not see as his people, can be helpful here. Moses could well have viewed enslaving and killing Israelites as a tragic necessity, following Pharaoh's view that Israelite freedom represented an existential threat to Egyptian society. His ultimate refusal to justify violence against the enslaved Israelites, listening to their cries, seeing their suffering before his eyes, and taking steps to prevent their further suffering, marks a moment of compassion that I think we can learn from. I don't think that Moses, as he's typically depicted throughout the rest of his life in many sources, is such a great model, but there's something compelling about this moment. About this moment that Simcha Zissel Ziv, this 19th century Musar teacher, holds up as the key moment of compassion to emulate. That we're required to listen to the voices of the other, whoever the other is for us, the people whose suffering we would prefer to ignore. And images can be helpful here, keeping before our eyes images of suffering, not just the suffering of those whom we see as our people, but also the suffering that mass violence brings to those who we do not see as our people. This sort of conception of compassion incorporates justice within it, and it also incorporates a sense of solidarity with others across lines of difference. I'll conclude this evening by saying a little more about solidarity as a virtue in its own right. As I've defined it here on the handout, solidarity might be understood as the disposition to stand with others in the face of injustice, often across lines of difference. And so you can see the way that it's, by definition here, intertwined with a sense of justice. Solidarity, justice, and compassion are often intertwined and maybe should always be intertwined. Being just should require being compassionate and having a commitment to solidarity. Being compassionate should require a commitment to justice and solidarity with others. and solidarity should ideally be guided by justice and perhaps also by compassion. But it's worth highlighting the importance of solidarity in this trio of virtues in its own right, and some wisdom about solidarity from Musar literature. Part of why solidarity is so important at this moment, I think, is that claims about solidarity as a virtue have played an especially central role in justifying mass killing in Israel-Palestine. I've seen it playing a particularly central role in Jewish discourse about supporting Israel's military campaign in Gaza. So, for example, one prominent American Jewish advocate of the war, Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, wrote a number of influential essays during the first months of the war centering solidarity as the preeminent virtue that should require American Jews to support Israel's military campaign in Gaza. Solidarity for Jews, Kurtzer argued, means committing to Jewish peoplehood above all. And he understood Jewish peoplehood in nationalistic terms as requiring support for the Israeli war effort. Solidarity, he wrote in one essay, requires continuing support of Israel throughout this war, even as a brutal war will become more brutal. And as he put it in another essay, solidarity with our fellow Jews means supporting this war against Hamas, as awful as it will be. Those demanding a ceasefire were failing this test of Jewish solidarity. This kind of model of Jewish solidarity depends upon a conception of how the Jewish people are a fixed group with a clear identity and a clear set of group interests, which here are represented by the State of Israel. The scholar Noam Pienko, in his book Jewish Peoplehood, has documented how this conception of the Jewish people, a nationalistic kind of conception, has emerged over the course of the past century and assumes that boundaries of peoples are fixed and stable and can be tied to nation states, so that one has a primary duty to one's people and the state that represents that people. I think there can be great beauty in a sense of duty to particular groups of people, especially when those groups are marginalized and oppressed by others. But I also think that it's a mistake to imagine that peoples have these firm boundaries and interests, and that their interests are represented by their nation states, and that solidarity with a people requires standing with a nation state as that nation state engages in mass killing. Solidarity with one's own group and showing particular concern for one's group is beautiful and valuable, but not when it draws such sharp divisions between groups that it justifies causing grave harms to those who are beyond one's group. There are compelling models of Musar that can help us think about solidarity in a more capacious way. And again, on this holiday of Pesach, Passover, we might turn to the story of the Exodus from Egypt as it has been understood by some Musar teachers as a source of guidance. One thing about the story of the Exodus, as it is often told, is that it shows how the boundaries of the people of Israel, or the Jewish people, are permeable, and that the people of Israel are diverse and have a whole range of interests. A host of figures in the story, as it's traditionally told, show the possibility of standing up to state power and also of crossing boundaries with people who do not seem to be in solidarity with people who do not seem to be part of their people, including Moses, as I mentioned earlier, and including the midwives who disobey Pharaoh, and including what the book of Exodus describes as the mixed multitude, who seem to be non-Israelites who make common cause with the people of Israel in escaping from Pharaoh. The Musar writings of one contemporary scholar, Dr. Amanda Mbuvi, point to this dynamic and its implications for solidarity as a virtue. Mbuvi argues that solidarity at its best should acknowledge the permeable boundaries of groups and be oriented around justice for all people, rather than distinguishing between those whose lives matter more and those whose lives matter less. Mbuvi sees the latter approach to solidarity as the kind of approach associated in the biblical book of Exodus with the character of Pharaoh. So Pharaoh promotes solidarity among those he sees as his people, but he thinks that solidarity with his people can justify harms caused to other peoples who are viewed as a demographic threat. Pharaoh insists that his people must be the majority, and he sees the Israelites as too numerous, as dangerous, as violent, and as ultimately expendable. The people of Israel are tempted themselves to adopt Pharaoh's view of solidarity as their own, but the way that a movie frames the story, they find a broader vision of solidarity when the mixed multitude of non-Israelites joins them in escaping from Pharaoh, and they're challenged to stand in solidarity with them, whether or not those people are counted as part of the people of Israel. I put a movie's words describing this on the handout, and I'll read from there. Pharaoh's version of authentic humanity distinguishes between those humans who count and those who matter less, or not at all. It applies different rules to those within the group than those without, demanding violence against those perceived as a threat. But the Israelites' alliance with the mixed multitude illustrates the potential for partnerships that transcend the covenantal particulars that constitute the people of Israel's distinctive identity. Mbuvi goes on to describe that alliance with the mixed multitude as teaching the virtue of solidarity. The mixed multitude may be imagined as a threat, but the people of Israel are called to seek a partnership even with those who seem threatening and to find ways to stand with them. When people in her conception identify solidarity as a virtue, they stand with others in the face of injustice, even those who don't share their national or racial or ethnic or religious characteristics, and so are not easily recognized as their people. Many Jews today, certainly, are able to demonstrate such solidarity in supporting both Jewish Israeli and Palestinian efforts to fight against unjust violence. They may show particular emotional attachments to the plight of other Jews, but they also recognize that the requirement of solidarity with those who are not Jewish is also an obligation, and they refuse to cause harm to people from one group in the name of protecting the group with which they more closely identify. That's a notion of virtue that I think is very important to uphold as we continue to hear the calls that we hear to support the mass killing of civilians. I think that these three virtues, justice and compassion and solidarity, understood in these ways, can help us. I think they can help us oppose the violence that leads to the mass killing of civilians. I think they can help us see the injustices of the current crisis so that maybe we can insist on better sorts of solutions, so that we can better fight for a lasting ceasefire that will ensure the return of hostages and an end to all violence that threatens civilians, and for the kinds of diplomatic and political efforts that will pay attention to suffering on all sides and address the crises in Israel-Palestine. I know it sounds futile to imagine that there could be any end to the violence and any lasting solution anytime soon, but if nothing else, I do hope that we can build communities that do better in standing up to mass killing. And I do hope that we can build our own capacities to respond to mass killing with virtues of justice and compassion and solidarity. The work of building communities characterized by qualities like these qualities is really hard. I can see those struggles personally when I look at Jewish communities, when I see how over the past year and a half, so many existing Jewish institutions have struggled to engage in critical dialogue about these sorts of issues or to encourage the kinds of practices of reflection that I think are important to building virtues such as these. But I also see reasons for hope. I know that there are communities of people all over the world that have done well in nurturing virtues of justice and compassion and solidarity. And I hope that we can look towards a future in which those virtues are more widespread than they are today, and that can help us stand up to those who insist on violence. I'm eager to hear your thoughts your questions, your comments. I'll open up the floor here and invite you to raise your hands with your questions and ideas.